The silence of the South African veldt is usually a comfort. Today, it is a suffocating weight. It is 1900. The air does not smell of dry grass or rain. It smells of sulfur and ruin. You are standing 20 yards from your front door. The men in the khaki uniforms, the British, are not looking at you. They are efficient, almost bored. You watch as a torch touches the dry thatch of your roof. There is no gunfire here. There is only the crackle of dry timber giving way. You watch your life dissolve into smoke. The table where you broke bread this morning, the heavy wooden chest, the family Bible recording 100 years of lineage. It is all turning to ash in front of your eyes. An officer checks his pocket watch. You are given 10 minutes. You are not a soldier. You are a mother. You have 10 minutes to decide what pieces of your existence can be carried in a single sack. Then you are moving. You are herded like livestock into the back of an open coal truck. There is no roof. As the train jolts forward, the sky turns gray and opens up. The freezing rain mixes with the soot on your cheeks, running down your face like black tears. The soldiers told you this was for your own good. They told you that you are being taken to a place of safety, a place of refuge. Hours later, the train screeches to a halt. You step down into the mud and look up. It isn't a village. It is a city of canvas. Thousands of white tents and in rigid military lines stretching to the gray horizon. And surrounding them, glistening in the damp light, is a fence of sharp, twisted iron. You have not been brought to safety. You have been brought to the birthplace of the 20th century's darkest invention. When we imagine the British Empire at the turn of the 20th century, our minds default to the polished aesthetic of period dramas. We picture Downton Abbey, stiff collars, and the unshakable code of gentlemanly conduct. We are conditioned to believe that warfare in this era was a noble affair, soldiers fighting soldiers on a defined field of battle. Cinema has reinforced this illusion, but the reality of 1900 South Africa was not a battle for honor. It was a systematic dismantling of a society. To understand the severity of this, we must confront a term that history has largely anchored to the 1930s and 40s: concentration camp. Most of us assume this concept was a Nazi invention. We believe it belongs exclusively to the darkest chapters of World War II. But this is a historical error. The term concentration camp was popularized decades earlier, not by a totalitarian regime, but by the British Empire. It is vital to make a precise historical distinction here. These camps were not designed as extermination centers. They were not built with gas chambers. Their intended purpose was bureaucratic: to concentrate the non-combatant population into manageable zones, thereby cutting off support for the Boer guerrilla fighters. But this distinction offered no mercy to the people inside. The British High Command applied industrial logistics to human containment, but failed to calculate the human cost. They created artificial environments where overcrowding and lack of sanitation made death a mathematical certainty. This was not a war of glory. It was a grim milestone in military history. The moment a modern superpower decided to wage total war not against an army, but against women and children. To understand how the world arrived at this point, we have to look at the mismatch of the century. On one side stood the British Empire, the undeniable superpower of the age, a global machine that controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. On the other stood the Boer republics, independent states formed by descendants of Dutch settlers. The catalyst, as is so often the case in empire building, was what lay beneath the soil. The discovery of immense deposits of gold and diamonds turned these quiet republics into the most strategically valuable real estate on the planet. By 1900, the British military believed the war was already won. They had marched their columns into the Boer territories and captured the capital cities. By all traditional military metrics, the war was over. But the Boers refused to play by traditional rules. Instead of surrendering, they dissolved their armies. They traded formal uniforms for civilian clothes and scattered into the vast, rugged landscape. They formed commandos, mobile, agile units that struck from the darkness, sabotaged British supply lines, and then vanished back into the veldt. The British Army, built for rigid formation battles, was paralyzed. They were fighting a ghost. Enter General Lord Kitchener. A man of cold, unyielding efficiency, Kitchener realized that the British were not losing on the battlefield. They were losing because of the landscape itself. The Boer fighters could stay in the field indefinitely because they had a support network. The scattered farmhouses provided them with food, fresh horses, and intelligence. The women and children on those farms were the logistical backbone of the resistance. Kitchener's solution was a brutal exercise in logic. If he could not catch the fighters, he would destroy the environment that sustained them. He initiated the Scorched Earth Policy. The orders were absolute. British columns swept across the countryside, methodically burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and torching homesteads. But this created a new problem: what to do with the thousands of displaced civilians standing in the ashes of their homes. Kitchener's answer was containment. If the women and children were the supply line, they would be removed from the equation. They would be swept up and deposited into guarded encampments along the railway lines. The strategy was designed to break the deadlock of the war. Instead, it broke the moral standing of the empire. The architecture of this disaster was not built on malice alone. It was built on a foundation of lethal incompetence. Across South Africa, the British military established a network of over 40 concentration camps. Places like Bloemfontein and Irene were transformed from open scrubland into high-density containment zones. The primary unit of housing was the standard British Army bell tent. By military regulations, these canvas structures were designed to house 5 soldiers with their equipment. In the camps, however, regulations were discarded. Administrators packed 15 to 20 civilians into a single tent. These were not soldiers hardened to the elements. They were families. The canvas offered zero insulation against the extremes of the South African climate. In the summer, the internal temperature soared to oven-like conditions. In the winter, the frost permeated the ground where the children slept. But the true weapon of the camp system was not the weather. It was the spreadsheet. The administration's cruelty was most visible in the official ration policy. The British authorities divided the civilian internees into 2 distinct categories, codifying starvation into the camp regulations. Families whose husbands had surrendered were granted the standard ration. But families whose husbands were still out on commando, men still fighting the British, were placed on a punitive scale. These women and children were deliberately given smaller portions. Crucially, they were denied meat. The logic was transactional. Starve the family to pressure the fighter. The nutritional content of these rations was catastrophic. There were no fresh vegetables. There was no fresh milk for infants. Often, the food supplied was nothing more than raw flour, sugar, and coffee. Without fuel to cook, mothers were often forced to mix raw flour with dirty water to create a paste for their children. This dietary collapse was compounded by a total failure of sanitation. Soap was not provided. Clean water was a luxury. In many camps, the latrines were dug adjacent to the water supply, creating a closed loop of infection. The camps were run with a chaotic indifference. There was no master plan for hygiene, only a master plan for containment. The British military had successfully concentrated the population, but in doing so, they had created the perfect incubator for disease. The horror of the camps was not defined by the bayonet or the rifle. The guards did not need to fire a single shot to facilitate mass death. The true executioners were invisible, microscopic, and thriving in the filth. Typhoid, dysentery, and the most efficient killer of them all, measles. In a healthy society, measles is a childhood rite of passage. But inside the camps, Where immune systems had been dismantled by the starvation rations, the virus underwent a terrifying transformation. It moved through the crowded tents with the speed of a wildfire. For a malnourished child, the infection did not result in a fever and a few days in bed. It resulted in total physiological collapse. The respiratory systems of thousands of children simply shut down. The suffering was so acute, and the death rate so inexplicably high, that the internees began to suspect a darkness beyond simple negligence. Paranoia took root in the camps. Mothers whispered that the British were intentionally poisoning the rations to accelerate the die-off. Stories circulated of blue vitriol, copper sulfate, being mixed into the milk, or ground glass hidden in the sugar. While the historical analysis suggests these were likely rumors born of trauma and distrust rather than policy, the psychological terror was absolute. Every time a mother fed her child the gray camp rations, she had to suppress the terrifying thought that she might be administering the poison herself. The atmosphere of the camps became defined by a specific, haunting sound. Accounts from the time described the nights not as filled with screaming, but with a relentless, dry, rhythmic coughing. It was a chorus of thousands of lungs struggling for air, echoing under the cold southern stars. The result was a demographic catastrophe. By the time the camps were finally closed, over 26,000 Boer civilians had perished inside the wire. The tragedy of that number is in the demographic breakdown. Over 22,000 of the dead were children under the age of 16. To understand the scale of this failure, consider this. More children died in the British concentration camps than fighting men died on all the battlefields of the war, on both sides combined. You are sitting cross-legged on the hard earth floor of the tent. The air is stifling, smelling of sickness and unwashed wool. In your arms, you hold your daughter. She is 6 years old, but in your arms, she feels terrifyingly light. The fever is the only thing suggesting life remains. She is radiating heat, and her breathing is shallow. You replay the conversation from this morning in your mind. You stood outside the medical tent, hat in hand, begging the camp doctor for a single tin of condensed milk. He didn't look at you with sympathy. He looked at you with annoyance. He told you there was no milk for your kind. He implied that her sickness was your fault, that if the Boer women simply washed more, their children wouldn't be dying. He withheld the cure and offered you an insult instead. Now you listen to the sounds outside. You hear the rhythmic creaking of wheels on the dry dirt. It is the morning wagon. The internees call it the Meat Wagon. It circles the rows of tents every morning, collecting the small bundles wrapped in blankets before the sun gets too high. You pray it passes you by. You hold her tighter, willing your own strength into her small body. But then, the rhythm in your arms changes. The shallow, ragged breathing hitches. Once. Twice. And then, it simply stops. The silence that follows is louder than any cannon fire you heard during the war. There is no time for the luxury of mourning. There is only the brutal logistics of disposal. You have no wood for a coffin. The British have used it all for their own fires. You have no shroud. You take the wool shawl from your own shoulders, the only thing protecting you from the biting wind, and you wrap her in it. You pick her up. She is impossibly light. You carry her to the edge of the camp yourself. The ground is hard as iron. You scratch at the red earth until your fingernails bleed, digging a shallow trench in the acre of babies. You lay her down. You do not have a headstone. You find a jagged rock, place it at the head of the mound, to mark that she existed, and you walk away. You are not a soldier. You never fired a gun. But you have just paid the ultimate price of the war. The British Empire had hoped that the silence of the veldt would keep its secrets. They were wrong. The truth did not come from a foreign spy or a captured general. It came from a British woman. Emily Hobhouse, a humanitarian and welfare campaigner, had traveled to the camps to deliver aid. What she saw there, the skeletal frames of the children, the open sewers, the mass graves, shattered her. She returned to England not as a quiet observer, but as a witness for the prosecution. When she began to speak, the establishment turned on her. The press branded her a traitor. They called her a pro-Boer sympathizer who was undermining the war effort. She was spat at in the streets. But Hobhouse had something the empire couldn't spin. She had data. She had the death rates. Her reports reached the halls of Westminster. The Liberal opposition leader, Henry Campbell Bannerman, stood up in Parliament and delivered a phrase that would stain the government forever. He declared that the war was being fought by methods of barbarism. The government, desperate to manage the PR crisis, tried a tactical maneuver. They dispatched an official commission to South Africa to investigate the camps. In a calculated move, they appointed an all-female team led by Millicent Fawcett, a known supporter of the war. The government expected a whitewash. They expected these women to defend the empire. They miscalculated. The Fawcett Commission arrived, saw the horror, and even they could not deny the body count. Their report confirmed the catastrophic death rates and the gross negligence of the administration. Shamed on the global stage, the British military was forced to act. Reforms were implemented. Rations were increased. Doctors were dispatched. The death rates began to drop. But for 26,000 women and children, the reforms were merely a footnote on a death certificate. And there is a darker shadow still. While the world eventually learned of the White Boer camps, another tragedy was unfolding in parallel, almost entirely erased from the history books. Over 100,000 black Africans, farm laborers and their families displaced by the Scorched Earth Policy, were also herded into their own segregated network of camps. Their suffering was identical, but their documentation was non-existent. They received less food, less medical care, and almost no public sympathy. It is estimated that at least 20,000 black Africans perished in these camps, nameless and unrecorded, their graves lost to the grass. The methods of barbarism were colorblind in their cruelty. The war officially ended in 1902. The tents were struck, the barbed wire was rolled up, and the survivors were sent back to the ruins of their farms. But the war for the soul of the country had only just begun. Trauma does not simply vanish, it incubates. The bitterness forged in these camps did not dissipate with the peace treaty. It hardened. It festered in the minds of the survivors and was passed down to their children like a dark inheritance. This collective trauma became the fuel for a fierce, exclusionary Afrikaner nationalism. Historians argue that the seeds of apartheid were watered in the concentration camps of the Boer War. The victims of 1901 grew up to become the architects of the oppressive regime of 1948. It is a tragic lesson in the cycle of history. Hurt people hurt people. The cruelty of the British Empire eventually birthed a new, different kind of cruelty that would plague South Africa for another half-century. Globally, the legacy was just as dark. The British did not invent the idea of rounding up civilians, but they industrialized it. They gave the world the term concentration camp. They sanitized the concept of mass detention, proving to the tyrants of the 20th century that you could imprison an entire population under the guise of necessity. What happened on the veldt destroys the comfortable myth of civilization. The architects of this disaster were not wild barbarians. They were educated, refined men who read Shakespeare and drank tea from porcelain cups. They represented the pinnacle of Western progress. And yet, through indifference and bureaucratic coldness, they presided over the slow, agonizing death of 26,000 innocent people. It serves as a permanent warning. Evil does not always arrive with a shout and a gun. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard and a justification. History is written by the victors, but the graves remain to tell the truth. If you want to uncover the dark chapters they left out of your textbooks, subscribe to the Scarlet Archives.